The chief of the Palestinian militant group Hamas says it's close to a temporary truce with Israel that would allow for the exchange of Israeli hostages for Hamas prisoners. US President Joe Biden also said he believes a hostage deal is near. Even as an agreement appeared to be taking shape, relatives of some hostages were angered by Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir's call for the death penalty for Hamas operatives currently in Israeli custody. At a tense meeting in the Knesset, relatives said plans to revive Israel's dormant capital punishment laws for Palestinian prisoners of war would endanger their own loved ones' lives. Israel detained a number of suspected Hamas fighters after the October 7th terror attacks. Now let's get the latest with DW correspondent Rebecca Ritters in Jerusalem. Rebecca, what's the latest you're hearing about those hostage negotiations?
Well, Gerhard, it certainly feels like the closest we've come to a deal being agreed. Of course, there have been negotiations ongoing pretty much since the beginning, since October, let's say 8th even, where these negotiations have been going up and down, on and off. They were getting pretty close. We were hearing prior to Israel's ground offensive, then that completely stalled the talks, and now we're hearing more and more positive noises coming out of the negotiations. We heard over the weekend from Qatar's Prime Minister Al-Thani. Now, he, of course, or the Qataris at least, negotiators playing a huge role in these hostage negotiations. We heard very positive words from him saying that a deal was close. Then, of course, we heard contradictory remarks from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying a deal was nowhere near being finalised. He's under a lot of pressure to remain firm. Of course, one of their main objectives, or the main objective, you might say, is to eradicate Hamas. So he's needing to maintain a public firmness on that line, while at the same time trying to ensure that these hostages are released. But this is certainly the closest we have now heard. We're hearing from the White House, and as you're reporting, also from Ismail Haniyeh, one of the Hamas leaders, saying that a deal is imminent. The deal we're talking about is somewhere between 50 and 100 hostages to be released, predominantly women and children, all civilians, none of the military captives, in exchange for some prisoners from the Palestinian side in Israeli prisons, women and children, up to about 300, as well as a 3 to 5 day ceasefire to allow for humanitarian aid to be let into the Gaza Strip. Now, that has been a major sticking point. Israel worried that it will give Hamas a chance to rearm and re-coordinate, regroup in this war, but we'll have to see if a deal does come to fruition in the next hours, if not days.
Rebecca, it appears from what we've seen earlier that relations between the relatives of the hostages and the government have become rather tense. Is that correct?
Well, we saw yesterday, and you were reporting it there in the lead-in, that a very tense session in the Knesset as members of the far-right, or part of the far-right coalition, this Ismail party, Jewish Power, they are seen as an extremist party. They are trying to reintroduce the death penalty for Hamas militants in prisons here, or that are held captive here. And that is something that the families, or many of the families of the hostages, say is counterproductive to getting their loved ones out of Gaza are alive. They think it will anger Hamas, that it will give them impetus to perhaps do harm to their family members in Gaza. So we saw a very heated exchange, very emotional, very passionate pleas from the families to these members who are championing this bill. Now, I'll also say that the bill doesn't have consensus in the coalition. It doesn't have huge support, so it may not go through, but the families think that even just talking about it is going to jeopardise the situation inside Gaza for their family members. So we saw, as I said, very heated exchanges, and even the members of the members of that far-right party calling the families of the hostages, saying that they are actually doing Hamas's work for them. So some very personal exchanges happening there. Families very worried that the government just isn't doing enough or isn't taking the right action to ensure that their family members are freed.
DW's Rebecca Ritters there reporting from Jerusalem. Thank you, Rebecca. Nearly 30 premature babies evacuated from Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital have arrived in Egypt for urgent medical care. Medics brought the babies into Egypt via the Rafah border crossing. That's the only way out of Gaza that Israel does not control.
An urgent evacuation. Premature babies bundled into ambulances to get them out of Gaza. The World Health Organization says all of them are fighting serious infections. The babies had been trapped at Gaza's largest hospital for days. Several others died after incubators at Al-Shifa stopped working amid power outages. United Nations teams helped coordinate the evacuation, working with Israeli soldiers to get the tiny patients out of the hospital, which Israel claims is home to a Hamas command centre. The babies were brought south, some reunited with their mothers.
I have twin daughters. I did not know about their condition. Today I saw them for the first time since I gave birth to them. Thank God I was reassured that they were fine. I was always communicating with Shifa and they told me, you can come and take them because their health has improved, but I could not reach them.
Waiting ambulances then whisked them across the Rafah crossing to Egypt, taking parents where possible.
They are innocent children, premature babies, toddlers. I left my 3 children in Gaza. I didn't even get a chance to hug them because I couldn't leave my daughter in this state. Something might happen to them. They could be bombed. My message to the world is enough. These are innocent children. We are just protecting our country, Palestine.
The children's agency UNICEF says it's working with Egyptian authorities to find out the circumstances of each evacuated baby, including those whose relatives are not with them. Doctors say they have a long road to recovery ahead, with many of them critically ill.
Let's bring in Toby. He speaks for the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF. He joins us from the Jordanian capital, Amman. Now, first of all, how are the babies and where are they currently?
Yeah, so the babies are currently in a stable condition. They're getting the care, thankfully, that they urgently needed. And we have most of the babies are now in Egypt getting more specialized care. As we know, the hospitals inside the Gaza Strip are massively overwhelmed. Al-Shifa Hospital could not look after the babies anymore, could not look after anyone. It's particularly almost completely non-operational. And that's why the health authorities called on UNICEF, UN and others to help that evacuation.
Now, there were also reports that some other babies died in Al-Shifa. What do you know about that?
Yeah, that's right. Our understanding is that reportedly, initially, there were 39 premature babies that needed urgent care. Sadly, by the time the operation happened and that we were able to coordinate and get to the hospital, there were 31 babies. 2 had died sort of within 24 hours, tragically, which goes to show why the operation was so urgent. And it's not even... We hope those 31, of course, that we can save their lives. It's tragic that we couldn't get there earlier. And it's tragic that the hospital has become this sort of centerpiece almost of the conflict. And it's not just Al-Shifa, it's other hospitals as well. But right now they're getting the best care they can, thanks to multiple partners, thanks to the Egyptian authorities as well.
Now, Gaza's Indonesian hospital is the last one still operating in the north of the Strip. What are you hearing from your colleagues on the ground there?
Yeah, that's right. So we heard horrifically that yesterday, according to the World Health Organization as well, there was reports of this attack in the hospital that hit the hospital. The conditions even before have been deteriorating day by day at that hospital as well. So the northern part of the Gaza Strip, the healthcare system is all but ended, which is why it's a massive concern. We have 2 out of 3 hospitals across the Gaza Strip not operating due to damage or lack of fuel. And we have children in densely packed shelters who are increasingly at risk of potential disease outbreaks, particularly as winter comes. And the healthcare system is not there to support them or treat them if they need urgent care.
Now, the World Health Organization has warned about the threat of disease spreading in Gaza. What efforts are underway to counter that?
That's right. So we have 1.7 million people displaced inside Gaza Strip. Around half of those, around 800,000 are children, and many are living in UN schools, in hospital grounds, in public facilities, densely packed together, families in classrooms. The conditions are horrific. You have very little access to safe water, about 3 litres per person per day. The emergency threshold that we try to reach is 15 litres. You have sanitary conditions which are getting worse, one toilet for hundreds of people. And of course, now with rains, you have the risk of waterborne diseases. You have children who have missed routine childhood immunizations who are now more at risk of preventable but deadly diseases. So this is a huge concern. That's why it's absolutely urgent that we can try and improve those conditions in those shelters particularly, but also elsewhere, to reduce the risk of any mass disease outbreak.
Thank you very much. Toby Fricker there from UNICEF. Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock has said a ceasefire in the Middle East would prevent Israel from defending itself. Speaking to DW, Baerbock defended Germany's refusal to back a ceasefire in Gaza. Instead, Berlin says it backs humanitarian pauses that would allow for aid to get into Gaza. She also hit out at criticism of Germany's support for Israel, calling it extremely disturbing.
Germany's foreign minister has a message for the Arab world. Taking a break from international diplomacy, Annalena Baerbock joined DW's Arabic show Jafar Talk for an in-depth interview on the war in the Middle East. First on the agenda, why Germany has so far refused to back a ceasefire in Gaza.
That would mean Israel would no longer be able to defend itself amid the ongoing barrage of missiles. Every day, Hamas makes clear that it wants to wipe Israel off the map. That means they want to annihilate Israel, and in such a situation, Israel has to protect its population. At the same time, we are working with our international partners, with the Americans, but also with many Arab countries, to do everything possible to ensure the people in Gaza have safe places where they won't be killed, where they can access clean drinking water and medication.
In visits over the past month, German officials have repeatedly emphasised their support for Israel, saying German history means it has a unique responsibility to the country. But critics in the Arab world say Germany's guilt means it's afraid to call out potential war crimes.
I am very irritated by those people, because to me it sounds like the complete relativization of genocide, the worst crime this world has ever seen. My country, the Nazi regime in Germany, is responsible for the deaths of 6 million Jewish men and women, the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Europeans in Europe. We have committed ourselves as an international community, and that's what international law is built on. That's the lesson we learned from the horrors of World War II.
Turning to the future of the conflict, Baerbock said it was likely that a peacekeeping presence of sorts would be needed to protect civilians in the long term, but she would not be drawn on where those troops would come from.
In order to ensure security, we need international responsibility. We've learned this from the terrible wars in Europe's Western Balkans. There, too, the international community assumed a responsibility to protect. It was also a situation where the worst crimes had been committed, and actors in the region had simply lost all trust. I see the same thing there.
The question now is which countries can command the trust of both the Palestinian and Israeli people.
Now, DW political correspondent Matthew Moore joins me. Matthew, Germany has been criticised for not supporting a ceasefire. How did the foreign minister justify this position?
That's right, Gerhard. Put simply, Annalena Baerbock says Hamas cannot be trusted to hold up its end of a ceasefire. At one point, she threw up her hands and said it's not simply a case of politicians saying stop this. So instead, Germany is working on humanitarian pauses that allow for aid to reach those people in Gaza who are desperately in need. And also for hostages to be released. This could be, she said, hours or even days. And I was struck, though, throughout the interview that she repeatedly sought to express her sympathy for the innocent victims on both sides of this conflict. She said the suffering of Palestinians kept her awake at night as much as the plight of Israeli mothers whose children were taken or kidnapped by terrorists on October 7th. But the bottom line, Gerhard, is Germany calling for pauses rather than a full ceasefire.
Now, Baerbock has also responded in that interview to criticism from the Middle East that Germany is turning a blind eye to the suffering of Palestinian civilians in Gaza because of Germany's responsibility towards Israel after the Holocaust. What did you make of her reaction there?
Well, this is a criticism that we've heard over and over in the past month. Last week, the Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was in town in Berlin, and he said because of the Holocaust, Germany was really not free to tell the truth, implying that Germany is ignoring human rights abuses. Baerbock pushed back really hard against this throughout the interview, and this was where she became most animated and most impassioned, saying that criticising Germany for its past is relativising the crimes of the Holocaust. And she said she was extremely disturbed by the accusation. She said for her there was no contradiction between standing up for Israel's right to exist and defending human rights.
Now, why did the German Foreign Minister do this interview now?
Yeah, Jafar Talk is a show that has real clout in the Arab region and on social media, so this was clearly an attempt to engage with the Arabic-speaking audiences and to explain Germany's position on this conflict. I have to say, this was the first time I think I've seen, since this conflict has reignited, where I've seen a senior German politician scrutinised in this way. This was a 36-minute interview, the full version of which you can watch online, but normally interviews like this might last 10 to 15 minutes at most. And Baerbock knew that this would be a challenging interview, and there was really no attempt to backtrack. If anything, she was defiant, setting out Germany's position on a ceasefire, on the lessons of the Holocaust, but also stressing that she is equally concerned about the suffering of Palestinians as well as Israelis in the region.
Our political correspondent, Matthew Moore, there. Thank you very much, Matthew.